you could do like a registration necessary for Zoom. So I don't know. The only thing I sent out is the invitation to the tech people.
Okay, I see 9 people now, so I'll be happy if we hit 20.
One minute to go. Oh, I need to make him a co-host quick. And then whenever I get on, I'll do the mute all first. So you guys will have to unmute yourselves.
Okie dokie.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and start letting people in. Hello. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to give like 1 more minute for people to hop on. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And then if folks are joining, I'll admit them later. So welcome, everyone. My name is Rochelle Traha, and I am the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator here at Capital Region Planning Commission. I just wanted to start by thanking everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedule, especially during the hectic holiday season. And we really value your guys' input, and we're excited to hear your feedback today. And so on the from our team at CRPC, we have Kim Marishak, who's on the call, and she is the Director of Planning. We also have Suraj on the call, and he is the Transportation Director. And then we also have our consultants, Jennifer Baldwin and Ryan Paul, that are going to facilitate the meeting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the reins to you guys, Jennifer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rochelle. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to present some of our preliminary findings and the draft network with you and get some feedback. So our agenda today, we want to be respectful. We have an hour of your time. So we've outlined, we're going to start by sharing a little bit about the Capital Regional Bicycle Pedestrian Plan, the planning process and the purpose, and then share a draft vision statement with you and get some feedback, and then some preliminary findings from our existing condition work, and make sure that resonates with you and your local understanding of the region. At the heart of the meeting, though, is to really dive into and share some approach
Join the meeting.
the development of the draft bikeway and trail network and get some feedback from you on how that looks and how it resonates with your understanding, and also share an overview of how you can provide more detailed comments. Again, this is just an hour, so we're trying to get through everything. It's a lot of agenda, but at the heart of it, we want to make sure that you are comfortable sharing your thoughts and opinions in either the chat, or we're going to run through some survey questions, and we can follow up with you after the meeting. And then I'll share with you the interactive map, which will allow you to zoom right into your area, your neighborhood, or your street of focus. And then you can put comments and see what your neighbors and coworkers and friends are also telling us about the network. So to get started, I'm going to switch over. We are using Mentimeter. So if you go in the chat, you can look, there's a direct link that Ryan Paul just posted. Or if you want to do the survey questions on your phone, you can go to menti.com and use this code up here. And then we've got 5 questions to ask you throughout the meeting, just to kind of keep us engaged and going. And the first question is, we're just curious, like how you primarily get to work or school, either drive, bike, walk, take the bus, or other. And if you have any issues accessing Menti, or just don't have another screen or a phone, you can also post your response directly into the chat for a question, and we can keep record of it that way. And it looks like we have about 25 participants, so we're going to give it a couple more seconds. For those of you that are just joining, we are going to be using Mentimeter throughout the meeting to get some interaction. There's a lot of doorbells ringing. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but it's funny on my end. But you can go to the direct in the chat. There's a direct link to the survey questions, or you can go to menti.com and enter in the code that you see on the top of the screen. So this is kind of just like an icebreaker question. We're just curious to see the interest and the primary use that you guys use as your main way to get to school or to work right now. All right, so as most of you, about 12 people said that you currently drive, people said that you bike. You guys can continue to, I won't advance this question, so you can still answer this question as you move forward, but we're going to keep going with the presentation.
Hey, Jennifer, real quick. If you guys want to, feel free to put your name and affiliation in the chat pod, so people can kind of get to know, to see who's all here in our virtual world.
Great. So then the first section, we really wanted to share a little bit about what is the regional bicycle and pedestrian plan and the purpose. And the reason we started this planning process is we wanted to meet some consistent goals across the region, such as increasing resiliency, really providing a more enhanced connectivity between the different parishes, creating a unified set of design guidelines so that a bike lane in one parish looks the same and is being built the same in another parish. So it just at a region level allows us to take that bird's eye view and make sure that that connectivity is happening regionally. It's also the development of an active transportation plan or bicycle pedestrian plan is really the first step to identifying potential funding sources. They're always going to look back and see if you have a adopted planning process. In today's world, there's a lot of potential new funding sources coming out to advance, bicycle and pedestrian programs. So this is a key step to get started and start to identify some priorities and how to improve conditions for everybody. Our planning process, we're doing a lot in this plan. It's a really exciting process. We've had some really strong engagement. This is another way we're just trying to get back with our stakeholders in the community to get some feedback. Most of the project to date has been more about making sure we understand the local conditions in the region and understanding, the context in each parish, and it's very different, so that we know a little bit more of that background before we start diving into recommendations. We've been meeting with parish leaders and stakeholders to kind of really get this draft network. So this is where we are in this process, is really, having this draft network, but before we move forward to prioritizing it and really detailing the recommendations. We wanted to, we're putting this out for public feedback, which is the heart of this presentation. Another key thing that we're going to start launching at the beginning of 2022 is the development of regional policy recommendations, program recommendations, to make sure that we're not just focused on infrastructure, it's all of the other support amenities and making sure that new sidewalks and bike infrastructure and trail infrastructure are considered and integrated with new development or other roadway projects. So we get this question all the time, and we thought we would just go ahead and put this slide in too, is what's the difference between a regional bicycle and pedestrian plan and a local bicycle and pedestrian plan? Because as you'll see in a couple of slides, we definitely understand that there's a mix. There's been a lot of rich planning work done in the region, and we want to honor that. We're not redoing anything. We want to make sure that we're reflecting those priorities and recommendations from local plans. But the importance of a regional plan is to make sure, like I said before, is take that bird's eye view, make sure that the region as a whole is able to have some connectivity, and that it's really kind of honing in on that parish to parish access. Whereas local plans are much more action oriented, looking at that local connection. Should I take, this street or that street? And at the regional level, it's just connecting our jurisdictions together and making sure there's consistency from a policy and program perspective. So with that, is there anything in the chat that looks like everybody's just introducing themselves, which is great, but no specific questions so far, so I'm going to keep rolling. The first step in the development of a plan is to really set that key vision, develop and draft a vision statement, and identify some themes or goals to accomplish both in the planning process and as a way to evaluate progress and implementation. And so the draft vision statement that we've crafted, and we'd like your feedback today, is that the Capital Region's network of safe, connected, and accessible bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure will support people of all ages and abilities as they travel to work, school, shops, parks, transit, and other everyday destinations. The bicycle and pedestrian system will increase residents' transportation independence and will enhance safety, equity, health, social connections, quality of life, economic development, tourism, and resiliency throughout the region. So you can see that's a lot, but this is really looking forward, 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. This is the goal that we want our recommendations to help us achieve in this broad vision statement. And to do that, like some of those specific words that you saw in the vision statement, we pulled out and say these are going to be the pillars of the plan, the plan themes. So that's making sure that we're prioritizing and really considering safety, connectivity from that regional perspective, inclusivity. So for bikeway planning, which I'll get to a little bit later, I want to make sure that we're developing a network for all ages and abilities. So even not our most experienced cyclists, but maybe that 8 to 80 crowd, our youngest and our oldest residents. We want to think about the benefits to health and equity that could be achieved throughout the implementation of this plan. We want to support the local economies and the regional economy. And of course, like climate change, resiliency, making sure we're really getting those environmental benefits to increase our mode share for active transportation. All right, so this is the key spot that we want to get some of your feedback and your thoughts after I just shared that draft with you. We wanted to move on to the next survey question, which is just going to be a rolling comment box. So if you could go back to Menti, again, you can click that link directly in the chat box or the code and just share your thoughts. Did that vision statement resonate with you? Was there anything missing, from those either plan themes or the vision statement that I read? And I can go back, if everybody can take the time to share your thoughts, I'll go back and make sure the vision statement is up so that you can consider that as you're answering the question. Looks like there's positive feedback so far. And that's a great comment, that it is a really lovely ideal to strive towards. And that's the exact purpose of that vision statement. What are we working towards, and how can we evaluate our progress? And there was another comment. This is a great point. You know, maybe it could be applied anywhere. So maybe we need to try and get some of that Louisiana culture interwoven in that vision statement to make sure that it really reflects the specific values and context in the Baton Rouge region. There's another good point about potentially connecting the existing plans that are already developed. It's a great comment. And for those, like the couple comments about being more specific, I think too, once we get to the draft plan stage, it's really those performance measures that calls out the specific ways that we're going to evaluate our progress, what we're going to do in order to achieve the vision statement. The vision statement in general is typically a very broad statement. And then the goals, objectives, performance measures are how we're going to achieve that vision. So that's the next step, but we wanted to make sure that the general vision that we're setting in the planning process, you know, reflects your feedback before we move forward with those more details. All right, well, for those that are still entering their comments or you're still thinking about that, you can keep doing that. I'm gonna keep going. We've got a lot to cover. So wanted to share some of our findings from our existing condition review, and then we'll do another poll question on pause for questions or comments, just to make sure that it reflects your local understanding. And as we've been mentioning, I think that the first thing that we did is we wanted to make sure we evaluated and understood the state of practice currently in the region. There's a lot of rich planning documents. You know, within each parish, you know, EBR has a adopted bicycle and pedestrian plan, but the long range transportation plans, there's just a lot of different planning studies that have been done that our team took the time to evaluate, making sure we were understanding the key takeaways, the recommendations that we could pull from these documents into the overall regional, you know, plan. And then making sure that we were also leveraging the public engagement that these plans had, so understanding the general themes that were identified in public engagement or that planning process. Another key step that we took is we want to make sure that we understand the context from an equity perspective. So we ran what we call our equity analysis, which really works to identify those within the region that have the highest vulnerability to transportation need. And so those dark gray areas across the region are the areas that have the highest need, so the most vulnerable users. And this is run off using census data, and it looks at specific inputs such as income, race, educational attainment, access to a motor vehicle, and a couple more inputs, but it puts this into a composite. And this is where we see, from an equity perspective, those darker gray areas are the areas with the highest need. So from an investment perspective, those areas could potentially be where we should be investing in active transportation improvements, because this is where folks may be living that, you know, have the greatest need. On the flip side, we also want to make sure we're understanding latent demand for active transportation. And so this shows a composite map with those darker red areas are the areas in the region that could have the highest demand for walking and biking. And this is using more local inputs such as transit, existing facilities, where those key destinations are, like schools, community centers, where we think people would be walking and biking to, as well. And then it pulls that into a composite to be able to highlight that. And the final step is we wanted to make sure we overlay both of them together. So this map just highlights from a regional perspective what it looks like when we overlay the equity analysis on top of the demand analysis. And so the dark burgundy areas on this map is showing the areas that have both the latent demand, so the key destinations, the places where people want to be able to walk or bike to, as well as the highest concentration of the most vulnerable users. And so these burgundy areas across the region, and different shades of like that brown and burgundy, are the areas in the region where the investment could be get the biggest bang for your buck. We could be helping our vulnerable users as well as connecting, those generators of walking and biking trips. Another element, going back to that, the plan themes, is we wanted to do a deep dive and understand the crash history within the region. So we've looked at both pedestrian crashes and bicyclist crashes. This map is showing the crash density for pedestrian crashes. You can see, I know it's hard to see at this regional scale, so we're just kind of moving fairly quickly. But the red areas are the segments of the roadway network that have the highest concentration or density of pedestrian crashes throughout the region. And then this map, the red areas are showing that density of crashes from a bicyclist perspective, where those existing bicycle crashes have occurred over a 5-year period. And this is really important. Exposure is another piece that we don't have exposure data for the region. So we don't know where people are walking or biking to be able to contrast this data. But it's always important to zoom in and identify, hot spots within the region and be able to take a look at that as we start to develop the network, how we can respond and perhaps implement, safety countermeasures or network improvements to address crash history. And then from another data point is we also just across the region, we wanted to identify the key barriers to active transportation, to walking and biking and getting around the region. And so some of those railroads are barriers specifically is I-10. So the interstate corridors are a significant barrier. The rivers, so the Mississippi River and access across, there's only a very finite number of crossings of the river. So that really is a focus of connectivity between parishes, as well as the railroad network. So there's a lot of railroads that cut through the parishes, and that can provide some accessibility issues. And then those red dots that you see on this map, these are barriers that the public told us during a former public engagement process earlier in the year. And so we had an interactive map where folks could really identify a specific intersection is really challenging to cross, or I can't get access this. And so there are publicly identified barriers. When we review of all the public input that we received through that MetroQuest public survey process, there are a lot of key themes that came out of the engagement that we received to date. Specifically, there was a desire for more direct connections. People don't want to have to go really far out of their way to access, main destinations and facilities. So making that direct connectivity is important. Traffic calming, cars driving too fast, or the number of cars on the roadway was a concern for folks. The need for more safe routes to school for children of all ages was identified by commenters, as well as, what I just showed, that barrier map. A lot of folks talked about the struggle of the interstates and the connectivity, the bridges, not having safe access across the Mississippi River specifically. And then you can see this map, there's just a ton of comments to kind of pour through. So I'm just really highlighting the feedback, but there's a lot of more detail that we've poured through and have taken into consideration as we move this planning process forward. So with that, from a general existing conditions context, we'd like to ask you, does this resonate with you? The equity and demand analysis and the safety, is there's something in the existing conditions for your neighborhood or parish that you'd like to put that in a comment, respond? You can do that in the chat or the survey, just to make sure. If you have any questions, we're happy to take questions now, or put in your comments and we will definitely capture them in the public comment period. And that would help if I advanced the question for you so you could start typing in your comment. So it's just yes or no. So do the existing conditions findings resonate with your local understanding? Did you hear those barriers that you kind of brought to today's meeting, thinking about how are we going to solve? Is there anything that really shocked you in what you saw today? And because this is just a yes or no, for those of you that are saying no, please put additional comments. Why was that a no in the chat? Tell us what you thought, is different, what you thought you'd see, but you didn't see. This is the time we'd really like to get those comments and feedback back from you to see if there's something that we can do to respond. All right, well, it looks like we've got 13 responses, so we're going to keep moving. You guys are being awful quiet in the chat. I'm used to chats kind of blowing up, so definitely put in comments. Now's your time. You can always submit comments separately through the planning process, which we'll get to a little bit later. All right, now what you've probably all been waiting for, the heart of the meeting that we wanted to get the feedback on is to just walk you through how we develop the draft network, show you a little bit more about the specific categories, and then how you can provide more detailed comments. So the first, actually, so I teased you a little bit. Before we dive into that, we did want to do another polling question because we want to understand biking, really depends on experience level. And so we just wanted to poll in terms of how would you describe yourself as a bicyclist? Would you be strong and fearless, which means that you don't care if there's any bike, you don't need facilities, you're very comfortable taking the travel lane and navigating with traffic. Enthused and confident, which means, a bike lane would be helpful, but you're still able to nimbly kind of go back and forth between the travel lane and roadway experience. It looks like right away, most of you are responding with the interested but concerned. And nationally, this is where the majority of Americans fall into, is that interested but concerned category. Folks are saying, I'd like to be able to bike more, but I'm not comfortable biking with traffic. And so that's where that concern comes out. And so from national research and best practices, we know that really to get those folks to get on a bike and choose to bike more, the separate facilities are really what appeals to them. That's, bike lanes, buffered bike lanes, separated cycle tracks completely out of the roadway, or trails. But I'm also glad to see, totally fine, there's a lot of folks that are just simply the no way, no how. A lot of times when I do pictures for this is the people that are walking their dogs with their car. There's just some people that that we're not gonna, they're just not interested in being on the bike. And that's fair, that's a certain part of our population. So just trying to get that, snapshot and understanding of where you guys as our audience today, associate with. All right, so in terms of, keep that in mind in terms of the national findings and what you guys just kind of proved to us in this small sample size, that if we're all mainly in that interested but concerned group, there's specific strategies that we know as practitioners of how we can appeal to that type of cyclist. And, first and foremost, we want to prioritize a low stress facility. That means you have much more structure and it's very clear to all roadway users how to navigate the roadway system. We want to identify alternative routes to get folks off of the major arterials, because, lower speed, lower traffic is really where people are most comfortable and feel safer. And then really prioritize those specific connections that, connect to the existing trail network that started off across the region, to schools, parks, really that demand analysis in the heart of those deep red areas of where we know that those trip generators are located. And then finally, from our network approach, we created a hierarchy of network categories. And because the region, and especially in much of our rural parishes, we're just starting to build this network. So we're starting from the very beginning. We want to make sure that we're being flexible in the recommendations. So they're grouped into categories instead of being overly prescriptive. And that just allows that flexibility in the design stage. A lot of the design of bike projects and trail projects, has a lot of different factors where you're going to require a lot more engagement with stakeholders and property owners, working with DOTD to really understand the right-of-way and if you need to purchase right-of-way, and just a lot of those design nuances. And so having that flexibility built into the plan really helps implementation, move move beyond just planning and allows that flexibility and implementation. So this image here is one that we like to use a lot in our bike ped plans. Is just referring to FHWA is also giving guidance on how to develop networks and select facilities. And it just kind of goes back to volume and speed are really the two defining elements to determine the most suitable facility type from a bike perspective. The higher the volume, the higher the speed means you need to get more separated from vehicular traffic. And that separation could be back of curb, it could be plastic bollards, it could be landscaped, could be on-street parking. There's a lot of different elements and ways you can go about it. It just means that the higher the volume, the higher the speed, all of this dark blue area means that it should be a shared use path or a separated bikeway. A couple other specifics for your region and for the work that we did, with this draft network is we wanted to look specifically at these 3 different topics. And it's one, roadway characteristics. So we're looking at the number of travel lanes, the speed limit, the volume, and the general topography to really determine and kind of apply each roadway within that graph that I just showed you on the last slide. We consider a bicycle demand and need. So all of that existing condition work, such as safety analysis, the demand and equity overlay, we want to make sure we're making recommendations where they make sense and where they're needed, today, and not trying to be overly prescriptive. Every road doesn't need a bike facility or a trail, so we need to be pretty strategic about where we're placing the recommendations. And then because this is a regional plan, we're also trying to be very focused on that regional connectivity. How are folks going to get between the parishes and really, prioritizing those regional destinations throughout the area. And then finally, this third category is the hardest to define, but then we also want to make sure at Alta, we want to prioritize feasibility. And this can often be harder to vision plan because you want to be visionary. We all might think that this will never happen because the road is the same because we grew up here, but we want to be visionary and yet we want to be realistic. We don't want to put lines on a map that will never ever be built. I think some of this could be pretty progressive and long-term in scale, but that feasibility is looking at a 2-lane roadway. We can't assume a separated bikeway is going to be on this very narrow, 2-lane roadway. So then maybe the most appropriate recommendation is just a paved shoulder. So context matters. And as you guys are aware, and what we learned very quickly is it's very different within each parish, and even different parts of each parish are very different. So the heart of Baton Rouge is very different from the northern part of EBR. And so really making sure we're being appropriate for the recommendations based on the local context and what folks like, yourselves have been telling us throughout the planning process. So we have 4 distinct categories on our draft network. And like I said before, we've taken the approach of these high-level categories. So the first category is an on-road bikeway. And this is just saying that a dedicated space for bicyclists is needed along this roadway. That could be the flexibility, the tools in our toolbox could be a bike lane, a buffered bike lane, one-way cycle tracks separated by plastic bollards if you're going for more of that quick build approach, or it could be separated by on-street parking. The key to the separation is that there's some sort of vertical element in that separation. So that's the on-road connectivity segment. We're also having a category for paved shoulders. This is to acknowledge the context of some of the more rural areas of the region, and also to provide safety benefits for all users. There's a lot of 2-lane roadways that have no shoulder, and research has shown if you add a shoulder, then you're also increasing safety. It provides a pull-off space for vehicular emergency situations. It could potentially be providing a space for pedestrians to access if needed. But the key for the paved shoulder recommendations is that there would not be any bicycle stencils or markings within that area. And then we also have a few select arterials where we've identified the need to put them in this category called complete streets. And this is just really identifying that this corridor is significant. There could be transit along the corridor, a lot of significant trip generators, a high equity need area of the region, and that more analysis is needed, but we wanted to identify the the importance of that corridor and the role that it plays in the region. And so it's not prescriptive. It's not saying there needs to be a bike lane or, a shared use path. It's just for future development that's occurring along the region, need to start thinking about that connectivity. And from a policy perspective, we can also be thinking about how that context is, shaped, and we achieve that complete street vision moving forward. And then the final category, one of the most exciting categories, I think, for your region is to really build and capitalize off of the existing trails that you guys already have in the region. And trails can occur mainly in about 2 different ways. They can either be a side path, which is using the existing roadway right of way, so it's right next to a roadway, or it could be completely off the road, typically along a greenway corridor. It could be a utility corridor or a riverbed with some environmental review and potential constraints too. And so predominantly, for going back to that interested but concerned group and audience, the trails is the premier feature facility. Everybody is comfortable. A lot of it, trails that you guys have, what you start to see is the demand on these trails, especially throughout this COVID, global pandemic, is just skyrocketing. You can start to have to deal with crowding of the trail system and how you navigate between conflicts between pedestrians and bicyclists. But we really want to leverage the existing trails that you have in the region and provide more of that connectivity so people don't have to drive to a trail. They can hopefully bike, or walk to a trail. And with that, introduction, ta-da, this is our draft network. This is just a draft, so this is not set in stone. It's out for public feedback through the very beginning of January. So again, we really appreciate your time today. But you can see from a regional perspective, those blue dashed lines are the proposed on-road bikeway. The green with the predominant recommendation across the region is how we can get some more trails. And this is where I think we have to, and I'd love your feedback, is some of these trail recommendations are visionary. They're adding a trail facility along roads that you wouldn't think, could do it, and it can be built, and we're just trying to create that regional connectivity. And a lot of folks told us about the idea about trying to create a loop so that you could get through all 5, and it could really be a tourism attraction and a destination for your region. There's a lot of, cities and regions that have happened across the country that have really taken advantage and capitalized on that. So that was some of our thought process of identifying some of those short-term priorities for trail improvements that can kind of build out from the trails that already exist, as well as some of those visionary trail opportunities that could really be a turning point from an economic development perspective for each parish. We have some of the.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. We just have a couple of questions in the chat for an example complete street in the capital region. And I would say government probably qualifies as a complete street, but I was wondering if anyone in the chat, some of these local experts, if you guys want to put any examples in the chat to answer Samantha's question.
Great. And the only other thing I would add, like the complete street category, it could be as simple as bus shelter, street lighting, or it could be a road diet that introduces a median. It's really, I like to think about complete street projects as improving the livability of the corridor. There's some of the recommendations is because when you look at that corridor, as I would not feel comfortable walking or biking on it today, but we know that all of the corridors that we did identify as a complete street, there are people that don't have a choice. They work along the corridor, they're relying on that corridor to access their key destinations where they live or where they work. And so that was the need to really identify and provide that significance from a complete street perspective.
And it looks like Mark is making a comment on paved shoulders and maybe some of the difficulties with paved shoulders. So I don't know if you had anything with that, Jennifer.
Oh, in the presence of rumble strips. Yeah, that's a great point. And thank you. That will come up and I'll talk a little bit about that for next steps. But as we start diving into our design guidelines, there's a lot of ways to do bicycle friendly rumble strips, just leaving that space, and having so that it's not such a, danger or safety hazard. So that's a great point. The other comment I'd like to say, I think on this map, so you see the solid lines, which you also see on the interactive map, but this is where pouring through previous adopted plans to make sure we really understand where the existing facilities are. And then we can't thank enough at all of you who participated in our parish meetings, and advisory council meetings. You know, I think every time we talked with folks, we learned of, oh, there's a little trail segment here or a bike lane, or, you know, there's a lot of energy and a lot of exciting new facilities that are coming online. And that really was the heart of where we started to developing the network. We wanted to make sure we were leveraging what's already in place, and you kind of grow the network out from the existing facilities that are there today.
And it looks like Whitney had a question about the side paths, if that was off-road or on-road.
Yeah, so our category in the network is just trail. So it's just a proposed trail, and within the data, and you know, once it's final, we can provide a lot more detail, but some of those would be along a roadway. So it would be either a side path, or some of them are, you know, utilizing their own roadway, whether that be along a utility corridor, or along a, you know, greenway riverbed or levee trail, like you guys have a lot of existing great levee trails in the region.
And it looks like Mark is asking about the EBR bicycle and pedestrian plan and sort of its integration into this plan.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so we definitely poured through it to try and make sure we understood the priorities from that adopted plan. It was just recently developed, so it's not the intent of this network to replace. It was really more, we can't show all of the recommendations, or it would be one giant spaghetti bowl in EBR, and then, you know, just want to be equitable across the other parishes. So instead, we pulled out those recommendations that we felt, and that kind of goes back to this slide where we're thinking about that regional connectivity. What are the main entry points into EBR and out, and what are the most significant, you know, projects within the Baton Rouge area? So, and this is a great point. Like, if you live in Baton Rouge, those are the comments. If you think that there's something on that map that is very significant from a regional perspective that's missing, but that was from the plan, that's a great comment to kind of draw in on the interactive maps to make sure we capture and understand.
And it looks like maybe there's a follow-up question from Whitney about off-road paths.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's definitely something we could consider. Whitney just made a comment in the chat that trails are often kind of, the name trails kind of makes folks think about recreational trails, and we want to make sure that our facilities are inclusive of all uses, and so potentially it could be off-road. We were really trying to simplify the legend, because as you can see, there's already a lot of colors, and so having off-road trails and on-road trails just adds a different complexity, but that's something we can definitely consider before we finalize the network.
And it looks like Kathy is asking about pedestrian accommodations and also if bikeways would be paved, but I think it's probably good to address the pedestrian part of this plan.
Yeah.
Jennifer, you know, as far as how we're approaching that.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Kathy. I think the first answer is all of the on-road bikeway recommendations, so anything you see in blue would be paved. The level of detail, we're not saying whether all of the green needs to be paved. We know that there is a balance of environmental sensitive areas and making sure we're meeting our resiliency goals. And so that level of detail, whether it's paved, what the facility type is, and the width, that's what's going to be identified as that project moves into design. We will be identifying some recommendations based on national best practice and local standards in terms of facility type, widths, when you pave and when you don't, in the design guidelines. That's going to be a future task within the planning process. And in terms of pedestrian accommodations, yes, like all of the trails will be both bike ped. Like I mentioned before, the paved shoulder recommendations could also provide that safety benefit for anyone that needs to walk along that corridor. But because sidewalks are a very local focus, we don't have a recommended sidewalk network. Instead, we're going to really tackle sidewalk improvements through the development and through policy change, and making sure we're coordinated and consistent in when and where we're requiring sidewalks. So that'll be featured in our policy recommendations. And we're also developing what we're calling pedestrian priority areas, which basically takes multiple inputs such as transit, again, that demand and equity, and identifies where in the region sidewalk investment should be prioritized. So really these downtown centers, across the region, where those trip generators and the most need is, would be those priority areas. So that'll be a future deliverable that you'll see in the draft plan. And then Kathy, I think you just said, what about accessibility? ADA access, will definitely be a policy recommendation, making sure maintenance recommendations are included. And then, accessibility from a bikeway perspective is just making sure we're thinking about connectivity. And then trails also have their own specific accessibility design guidelines and, recommendations associated with them. So we did want to share, I hope most of you have seen this already, but we've gotten some good comments so far. If you go to the CRPC's website, which here's the link, and then I think Ryan Paul is going to put it in the chat as well, we have an interactive map available of the draft network. So it allows you to zoom in and provide a comment, and I am going to move over and share my screen so y'all can see what that looks like in real time. So you can just zoom right in to anywhere within the region. You can look specifically, it allows you to get a lot more detail than I was able to provide on the slides for you today. But then you can also add your comments. You can review other people's comments, and then just clicking the heart means that you really support that idea. So it just helps us not to have redundant comments. So you can really like other people's, thoughts and ideas or add on to it in a way that's simple for you. So this is where we would love to get most of your more detailed, like I disagree with your recommendation here. Tell us on the interactive map, because what this allows us to do is it becomes GIS. We can map out where people disagreed or where the conflicts were, and then in our evaluation, it allows us to be transparent in the edits that we make to this draft network. And this interactive map, which we'll put it back up on the screen, it'll be open and live through January 7th. So with that, I'm going to advance to the next question. This is again just an open-ended question where we just wanted to say, what are your thoughts? What questions do you have? Concerns? If you've had a chance to look at the network or anything about what I shared in our approach in the draft to date. And I really appreciate the discussion and comments already placed in the chat, but here's another option for you to kind of give us your thoughts and feedback. And thanks, Mark, for that comment. I was just, checking the chat. It'll be important for us to take a look at, EBR's Complete Streets Committee's work on defining crosswalks, which, I've been a part of many conversations in different regions and cities across the country, and that's an interesting conversation. So important to have a common vocabulary across all parishes and jurisdictions. So thank you. That's a great heads up and something we'll definitely be looking into as we advance that task in the new year. The first question that was entered within the polling, will DOTD endorse the design guidelines from this plan? We really appreciate the participation and feedback that we've been, working with DOTD throughout this planning process. I don't think it'll be a specific endorsement, but we haven't gotten that far. So those are more continued conversations that will occur, as the planning process moves forward. They've been a great resource to us as we were working through the draft network to really make sure we were taking in anything that they had on their radar or funded projects, and then the overall local context. So they've been a great partner today in this planning process, and I'm sure will continue to be a great partner moving forward. It is ambitious. And so I should have mentioned too, before we got to this question, and like our next step really is we want to make sure we've got the right recommendations on the right streets and, you know, take all of your feedback into consideration. And then probably the most important product of this planning process is a phasing plan. So we want to identify, you know, this is the total vision of the network. What are the short-term projects that should move forward as a priority? Most likely those projects are going to be connected in some way to your existing facilities, so we can start building out from your existing network. To midterm priorities, and then what's our long-term like visionary recommendations that are great to have in this planning document, but will probably not likely move forward, you know, as a significant priority. The critical part about making sure we're capturing those vision projects is that we don't know what's going to happen next year. You know, this plan could be done and then all of a sudden maybe there's just a flux of federal funding and there's a lot of money and energy around a future development. So it's really important to also think about those visionary projects and how we can capture those in a planning document like this. Thank you guys for putting comments within the polling question. So I was waiting for somebody to ask, you know, what about the funding? And that's definitely the million-dollar question, and no pun intended, but definitely trying to, a future task is to evaluate all of the potential funding sources and understand the potential costs of these network and especially those short-term priorities. But the planning process is not where funding is allocated. It's just trying to make sure we can be competitive for the funding programs that are out there today and identify how to best leverage the different sources. I think the most successful regions and locations across the country are those that are really diverse in their funding schemes, and they're taking advantage of all sorts of different you know, and innovative funding sources, such as, you know, leveraging private development. There's a lot of, you know, different health CDC grants out there to kind of build some infrastructure, environmental benefits. And then of course, with this larger infrastructure bill, there could be a lot more potential ways to incorporate these recommendations in the larger roadway planning and infrastructure. So a lot of good comments. Within the time, I think we're going to keep moving. We can come back to this with any leftover time, but we want to make sure we kind of get through the overview and make sure you understand in terms of that timeline for when we need your comments and the overall planning process. So you can keep entering. If you're still entering comments, please do that both in the chat and in the Menti question. So in terms of next steps, like I mentioned, the public comment period, you know, we launched December 1st and we're going to be closing on January 7th. And so please make sure that you encourage your neighbors, coworkers, friends, family to take a look at our interactive map, get your comments in specifically about the network. If you have any questions, I'll pop up on the next slide, you know, Rochelle's email for a specific contact at CRPC or my contact information. We're happy to answer any questions or concerns that you have if you want to document them through email. And after January 7th, we're going to take all the feedback that we've heard, make some more revisions, potentially reach out to some of our stakeholders as we try and navigate and finalize this network. And then, like I mentioned, the next step is to prioritize it, to make sure we understand, you know, where do we start first? Because as someone said in the polling question, it is pretty aggressive, it's ambitious. And so we want to make sure that we're leaving you with a blueprint of where do you start first. And that's going to look different for each parish. And that's, you know, that's sometimes the complexity of a regional plan. It's not a one size fits all. You know, East Baton Rouge Parish is in a different part of their bicycle and pedestrian journey. There's already been a ton of improvements. There's a great existing network to kind of latch onto and some identified priorities. Whereas other parishes are kind of just starting and they've got some exciting projects that will be coming online within the next year or two. So it's not going to be a very prescriptive one size fits all for each parish. So our program and policy recommendations are definitely going to be context appropriate and kind of meet each parish and jurisdiction where they are, and then help them kind of achieve the next state and step in their active transportation mobility process. What we're working towards is doing the design guidelines first of the year, really identifying the policy and program recommendations that are going to be needed to support these network improvements. And getting to a draft plan to release by spring of next year. And I'm really excited that I got to start to say I'm going to do that next year. It's only 2 weeks, a couple weeks away, and then we're in 2022. So we're going to be moving pretty quickly, but you'll have access to review the overall draft plan, trying to keep that fairly nimble so that it can be short, to the point, and really easy to understand and follow. So it's a clear blueprint for how to push active transportation and mobility improvements forward within the capital region. And with that, do we want to, we finished a little bit early, there's about 7 minutes. If anybody wants, has a question and you feel more comfortable speaking and sharing your thoughts or putting into the chat, you could work too. Any questions that you have and you want us to address, now's the time. We can kind of facilitate a Q&A through the chat or the polling question. I can go back to the polling question so everybody else.
Jennifer, I know that was a good comment earlier that I saw by Doug Moore about barriers not only being physical, but cultural. So I don't know if you want to address anything like that, essentially institutional and systematic.
That's a great point. That was probably back when we were doing the existing conditions, and those barriers on that map was very physical. It's a great point. When we do recognize, there is a cultural barrier in North America as composed, compared to Europe. We have a different culture of yielding to pedestrians and safety culture. And so in Louisiana, as compared to Portland or Washington State or California, is going to be very different as well. So, and that came out a lot in the public feedback. So a lot of people were saying we need more education programs to make sure that folks are aware of the rules of the road and that we're all kind of operating from the same vocabulary of the rules and responsibilities. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. And thank you. Some of your responses here are a little bit more technical in nature. We will definitely be recording all of these, evaluating each one individually, and we'll follow up if necessary, to make sure we've got the most accurate data and information as possible. There's a good comment about we need to look at this from the viewpoint of the bicyclist or the pedestrian and not just try and shoehorn in facilities. That's really important and very critical for the design stage of, if any of these were to move forward to design. And that's what I keep referring to, that context sensitive. We need to do what's most appropriate for safety of the user and comfort of the user. That's really become over, I think it's just been the past 5 or so years where we've really been prioritizing user comfort. Some cities and regions are starting to say we want to prioritize fun. We want people to have fun on our streets, and it's just another way to say we want our streets to be livable for everybody, and we need to make sure we're being appropriate too based on the context of the corridor. Just with some good questions. We'll definitely look back and make sure that our facility language is matching some adopted plans where possible and feasible. So we'll definitely be doing, that and responding and reviewing these great comments and questions.
I think Samantha Morgan has something that she would like to say. If that's okay, Jennifer.
Hey, Samantha, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I'm looking at the map and I just had a question related to Government Street. I noticed that the map does not have the turn from Government Street onto Louisiana Avenue to connect to the T.J. Jemison Boulevard Greenway extension. So I was wondering if this proposed plan would in my mind, correct the stop of the bike lane on Government Street and have it go under the interstate and connect to the TJ Jemison lane, or is that just not, or what's going on there basically?
That's a great question. We would love, could you, if you haven't already, could you make sure that that gets asked within the interactive map so that we can, you know, look at that in context with the map? And that's probably more of like a one-on-one follow-up that we should have. But thank you for bringing that to our attention. And then Mark just asked about the Build Back Better money and how that could affect bike ped projects, and it will. I think it will definitely impact. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the first critical phase is having an adopted plan, and having an adopted regional plan also allows you to compete more effectively for different funding streams. I think from, you know, from our team's perspective, we've been chatting a lot about, it looks like most of that money will funnel through existing funding programs. So it just means that there could be a potential for more funding to really move active transportation projects forward. And I know, and there's still so many details, you know, from Alta's perspective, we definitely spend time navigating the infrastructure bill and the Move Back Better movement, and it changes every day. So until it's 100% final and everything is coming out and each state is doing things a little bit different, but what we know nationally is bike ped projects will be eligible, and in some ways will be prioritized as a way to leverage that fund. So I do think now's the time to be doing this planning process, and we're really appreciative for your feedback today to make this network as good as we can, and also have all the supporting design guidance and policies and programs in place for when this funding kind of is ready and available.
So I put my email in the chat. If there are any specific questions that we weren't able to get to today, and I can forward that on to Alta.
I can go back to show. So I think, Rochelle, from our perspective, that sums up what we had today for you in our presentation. And again, just go back to thanking you so much for your time. We'll make them the presentation and potentially the recording available on the website if you want to share that with anybody. And please keep populating your ideas, thoughts, comments into the interactive map, or send them directly to Rochelle's email address that she put in the chat. We really appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Like, just to reiterate what Jennifer said, my email's in the chat on the screen. And I just want to thank you guys very much for taking time out of your schedule to give us some really thoughtful and well, we understand that you guys are the experts out there, so we'll definitely be taking that into consideration. So thank you guys.
Happy holidays. See you next year. You want to stop recording, Michelle?